In recent videos, especially those in which I've talked about technique, the single strokes and the double strokes especially, I have talked a lot about the fulcrum with regards to how we hold the sticks. I talked about the three main aspects of the grip: the fulcrum, the fingers and the wrists. After doing my recent video on single strokes, I was contacted by a few people who had some questions about some things I said about the fulcrum, and this has prompted me to make this video today where I'm going to talk about the fulcrum in a little bit more depth. The fulcrum is the part of your hand that actually holds the stick and around which the stick pivots. As I said in the single strokes video, this is often a divisive topic in drumming because there are many authority figures who say with some conviction where the fulcrum should be and where it should not be. And this can certainly be, as I say, a divisive topic. This can cause some debate or argument among people who actually do know what they're talking about but don't necessarily present it in a way that is inclusive or suggestive. It's presented very dogmatically, which we don't really like in music. We want to try and avoid dogma as much as possible. So I'm going to address this debate a little bit today, present my take on the whole thing, and talk about how it's actually a non-issue, because a comprehensive and strong fulcrum encompasses lots of different things in multiple positions, rather than just one single way which must be held all the time. One of the contentious things that I mentioned in the previous video about single strokes was that the stick does not move in the fulcrum, and this prompted someone in particular to contact me and say, well, my stick is moving in my fulcrum. How do I address this, and why is this a problem? So again, this is something I'm going to talk about today. So let's get started. The fulcrum is, as I say, the part of the hand, the part of the grip that is responsible for actually holding the stick. Now for me, most of the time, that fulcrum is held and formed between the thumb and the first knuckle crease of the index finger. As I hold the stick horizontally like this, my remaining three fingers sit lightly on the back of the stick, and this produces my stroke. So if I just bounce the stroke, we can see at the front of the stick, at the front of the grip, the stick is held between the thumb and the index finger, and those back fingers are engaging with a little bit of wrist movement to produce the stroke. Now, if you prefer a middle finger fulcrum, we can hold the stick in this way between the thumb and the first crease of the middle finger, and that index finger just kind of sits and rests idly on the side of the stick, and we can achieve the same thing. You can see the difference there. That index finger is no longer engaged in holding the stick, it is just resting and acting sort of like a guide. In a French orientated grip, where the thumb is on top, we can do the same thing. We can have an index finger fulcrum where the stick is sitting on the thumb and the index finger, or we can remove the index finger completely and have the thumb sitting on top of the middle finger. It doesn't really make a difference. We can also have the stick kind of sitting equally across both of them, and the thumb is pressing the stick down almost into the gap between the two fingers. Now for traditional grip, which is not a strength of mine, but I can address it a little bit, that fulcrum is like a seesaw. It sits underneath the stick. So you can see my hand is completely flat there, palms open, thumb on top, and the thumb is just kind of pinching the stick into the crease of the knuckle there, into the crease of the thumb. And the stroke can be formed simply by rotating the wrist or the thumb movement on its own. And sometimes in traditional grip, we bring the fingers on top to aid in that bounce. But you can clearly see the fulcrum there. As I say, it's not a strength of mine, but the thumb is holding the stick in that little V shape there between the thumb and the hand. And a thumb motion or a bit of wrist rotation creates the stroke. Now, as I said in both of those aforementioned videos, far more important than where the fulcrum is that we have one and that it is engaging properly. We know what we are supposed to be doing with it. In my experience, both with my own playing and with my students and other drummers who have technical issues, the number one problem from a technical standpoint is a weak fulcrum. We can see this very easily if we take a few simple exercises. We're going to do a triplet followed by an accent. We can think of this as triplet and. And we're going to try this first of all with our strong hand in multiple positions. So first of all, in a French position, with the thumb sitting on top of that index finger. The strokes in this instance are going to come from those back three fingers manipulating the stick. Now my thumb there is applying pressure downwards onto the stick to hold it strongly against that index finger underneath. That doesn't move, and those back 3 fingers do all the work. If you see it from the side or from the other side. We can then try the same thing by removing the index finger completely. So now that thumb is applying pressure downwards onto the middle finger, and those back 2 fingers with a little bit of thumb rotation on top are providing the stroke. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to get that index finger completely out of the way. Now, of course, that looks and feels a little bit awkward, but it's demonstrating how that index finger is not actually necessary to produce the stroke. So if I were playing this for real, I might just rest my index finger here, not actually engaging on the stroke. We can also try this with the finger, as I said a moment ago, pressing down into the gap so that stick is sitting evenly across both fingers. And then as we play this repeatedly, we can actually practice shifting that fulcrum from the front finger to across both to the middle finger and back again. And you'll notice it's a little bit of a difficult transition, but we're just experimenting with how that fulcrum position changes how the stroke feels and if it sounds any different. And what we will find is it's unlikely to sound any different on the drum, but it feels different in our hand. It's engaging different muscle groups, it's engaging the fingers in a different way. We can now try the same thing with a matched grip where the thumbs are facing inwards. If we were playing together like this, those thumbnails would be facing each other. And we can again begin with the index finger, thumb on one side, first crease of the index finger on the other, and for now that stick is just resting underneath my wrist, so it's not going anywhere. In this position, again, these 3 fingers, the fingertips, just sit loosely on the back of the stick, and I can try the same exercise. Now, as I do the accent especially, that thumb and index finger have to engage a little bit more strongly to keep the stick in position so that the momentum carried through the fingers and the wrists doesn't dislodge the stick. If you have a weak fulcrum, you will find that stick starts to slip around in the fulcrum, or it will start to rotate and your thumb will start to go with it onto a top position. So that thumb and index finger need to be strong enough to actually hold that stick in position. We can then again try the same exercise by removing the index finger. This time the stick is held between the thumb and the first crease of the middle finger, again quite strongly, and those back 2 fingers are performing the stroke. Now in every case here, there is enough space at the top of the hand to allow a second stick to sit in there. We don't want that stick to be sitting high up in the hand so that it's right up against the top knuckles and the roof of the hand, if you like. We need that to be low down in the hand, close to the fingertips, so that there's enough movement there. Now again, what you are likely to find when we remove the index finger is that this fulcrum here is not strong enough and the stick slips up into this position. So again, this is highlighting a potential weakness in the fulcrum. Now I'm raising that index finger for the sake of demonstration. If we were playing like this for real, again, we might just rest our index finger to one side and don't engage it in any way. And then we can experiment with the same thing whereby the thumb presses the stick into the gap between both fingers and the index finger and the middle finger are engaged equally. And again, a little bit of middle finger movement can get involved this time. That's a strong grip when you're employing 2 fingers to act as the fulcrum. But again, as previously, we can demonstrate or we can explore starting at the front and then gradually moving backwards until that index finger can lift away, then bring the index finger back and re-engage it until the middle finger is not engaging at all. Now, this is not something that I can easily demonstrate because it's how it feels in my hand. I was trying to emphasize the movement there. But the pressure between the thumb and the opposite finger starts forward with the first finger, then it gradually moves its way backwards to the middle finger. The index finger can lift off again, then it gradually moves its way forwards again, back to the index finger, so the middle finger can, in essence, lift off again. So at the moment here, again, I can't communicate it very well through video, but my fulcrum is entirely between the thumb and the index finger. In this instance, the middle finger is completely free to engage with the stroke. When I'm back here on the middle finger, maybe it's a slightly stronger grip, but that middle finger is not as free to engage. Now, there are reasons we might choose either of these three permutations, and that is for you to discover as an artist. That is for you to discover as a drummer. I think I would be very wary of anybody that tells me you must always do it one way and all of the others are incorrect, because there are periods where a middle finger fulcrum is more appropriate. There are instances where an index finger is more appropriate. There are instances where it kind of sits somewhere between the two and it actually moves. But the point here that I'm getting at is that the strength of the fulcrum needs to be enough to hold the stick in position. Now, this is where the exercises that I've just been showing you come into their own. For me, my right hand is my dominant hand. So we can now explore the same exercises with our weaker hand, which for me is my left hand. Going back to a French position with the thumb on top of the stick. Watch what happens if I remove that index finger completely. You can see very noticeably a weakness in control when compared to that right hand. My thumb here is having to engage quite strongly to hold the stick in position against that middle finger, and these back two fingers don't quite have the level of control of the right hand to articulate those four strokes strongly enough. Now, if I re-engage the index finger, so my fulcrum is here between the thumb and the index finger, I'm a lot more comfortable. Still not as comfortable as with the right hand, but more comfortable than without that index finger. Now I can try the same exercise between both fingers, so the thumb is pressing down equally into the space between the middle finger and the index finger. And there was a bit of delay for the control coming through. And then, as previously demonstrated, I can shift. I can start at the back this time. There's a weakness in control. There's the thumb having to engage really strongly to hold the stick in position. And as I shift forward back to that index finger, I know you can't see it very clearly, but now the pressure, the emphasis is all on my index finger. My control is coming back a little bit, but then if I shift backwards, that index finger lifts off. You hear a slight delay in the rhythm. The control is not quite there. We can then, as before, turn the hand inwards. Let's try with just the middle finger. And there is our problem. A distinct weakness compared to that right hand. If I bring the index finger back, the control is more immediate. If I remove that index finger, distinctly weaker and less comfortable. Now, all of these things that we are finding on our weaker hand will directly translate to a weakness in technique when we come to play our rudiments. If I try and do the same thing with those index fingers off the stick, feels very uncomfortable and very awkward to play. Now, this is not to say we should all develop using the middle finger fulcrum to play our strokes. This is all to demonstrate an inherent weakness in the fulcrum, most notably in our weaker hands. So this is what I'm sort of suggesting here today. A lot of our technical problems come from a weakness in the fulcrum of the left hand, or the non-dominant hand, which for many of us is the left hand. So when we're playing on the drum kit, as I've said previously, that right hand, that dominant hand is playing a lot more constantly, a lot more regularly, frequently than the left hand, especially if we're in something like jazz where we've got these exploratory ride cymbal patterns. If you've played jazz for any period of time, your right hand will be quite comfortable doing that same thing. Try the same thing on the left in a French position. Again, a weakness in that fulcrum and a sort of diminishing of control across those fingers stops me playing those same figures anywhere near as confidently or strongly. So again, when we turn our hands, pun intended, to playing figures, rhythmic figures, rudimental figures, technically demanding figures, the weaknesses in that fulcrum are going to come to the fore and stop us playing in the way we want to play. As I said on the single stroke video, if my left hand fulcrum, grip, control were the same as my right hand, I'd be a far better player, and that would likely be the case for many of us. So, how can we address this? Well, we start to work on the strength of the fulcrum, specifically in that weak hand. One of the things I demonstrated in the single stroke video last time was trying to get to the point of doing this. Just maintaining a steady, controlled, easy bounce on one hand. Now, while we're doing this, we can use this slightly simpler pattern to explore again the different fulcrum positions. Index finger off, shift to the index finger, between the index finger and the middle finger, and then again, turning over into French position, index finger off, middle finger off, and then a combination of both of them, and then choose one of them. So at the moment I'm on the index finger. Can I maintain this while rotating over to that side position, and then back again? Now let's try the same thing with no index finger. Far less comfortable, just about managed it. And then rotating back again. So all the while, what I'm actually doing here, which is by far the most important aspect, is I'm increasing my own understanding and awareness of my own body and what those different fulcrums feel like. And this is really the crux of it. One of the best lessons I ever had, I asked the teacher about this. I said, some people say you should use an index finger fulcrum and a middle finger is wrong. Some people say you should use a middle finger fulcrum and an index finger is wrong. If both are really, really good players and figures of authority, what should I do? And their answer was very simply, learn both. Decide the relative merits for yourself. Apply it to yourself, armed with that experience, armed with that knowledge. So what we're doing here is learning how that different fulcrum position affects what it feels like to us. Now, I talked about exercises and strengthening that fulcrum. Any short bursts of strokes with accents, like the triplet figure I mentioned, are super effective at doing this because they require two things from the fulcrum. They require the stick held in position so that the fingers can engage, and they require a strong fulcrum and a snapping of everything to produce the accent at the end. Now, if I do this right-handed, compared to the left hand, that's all coming down to a weakness in this flat part of my thumb here that is just simply not as strong as it is on the right, not as engaged. So in the Snare Drum Virtuoso, which is a book of technical studies that I released recently, there are some dedicated weak hand studies that work through different tricky figures to make that fulcrum engage in a certain way. Now, what I've been doing recently to start to address this for my own playing is to work through some of those weak hand studies in multiple ways. I've been working through it in this position. I've been working through it in French position. And with and without the index finger. So in French position without the index finger. And for me, that's the weakest one of all. Left hand French position without the index finger. Again, it just exposes the weakness in this muscle here for the thumb that is just not as developed. When I do that on the right hand, that stick is locked in position and there's no tension. I should clarify here a distinction between strength and tension. When I'm talking about a strongly engaged fulcrum, I'm talking about something that is firm but relaxed. It is a strength that's born from control, not a strength that is born from tension. So when I'm here, that thumb and those fingers, they know where they're supposed to be. They are firm, they are controlled, but they are not tense. I'm not white knuckle squeezing. That same degree of strong, relaxed control is just not there, or at least not there to the same degree in the left hand. Now, some of the double stroke figures in the Snare Drum Virtuoso work on diddled accents. And And that's another good one for working on the fulcrum, because we're playing an accented stroke, which is inherently louder, inherently stronger, and we're diddling it. Playing 2 strokes for the price of 1, and both of those strokes need to be strongly articulated with the fingers. But because we're emphasizing them as accents, again, that fulcrum needs to engage strongly. Because if it doesn't, that stick will move around in the fingers, it will move away from the fulcrum, it will move away from the thumb, and we will lose our degree of control with it. So these are all things that, again, we need to discover for ourselves, explore, practice, and develop, and hopefully, ultimately, increase our understanding of the fulcrum, make an informed decision for ourselves where that fulcrum should be for us, and in the course of doing that, strengthen the fulcrum so that our technique improves generally. To reiterate what I said at the start, a vast majority of technical issues, whether they're single strokes, doubles, paradiddles, or even buzz strokes, come down to a strong fulcrum, or the issues come down to a weakness in the fulcrum, most noticeably in our weak hand. So I hope this has given you a few things to think about. I hope this has given you a few ideas to go away and explore with your own playing. And I hope this has given you some insight into why maybe, despite the certain practice regimes you may be following, you're not experiencing the progress you might like, because that was the case for me. I would practice certain things for hours and hours, weeks and weeks, and not really experience the progress I was hoping for. And it's because I was focusing on the wrong thing. I was able to play double strokes, but my weakness in the fulcrum was not able to cope with it. So I should have been addressing the weakness in the fulcrum instead. This isn't a fix-all. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all of our technical problems, but is certainly something that I see in my own playing and in many of my students' playing. If we strengthen the fulcrum and we have a firmer understanding of where that fulcrum can be, how the different locations of the fulcrum affect our playing, and what the fulcrum is for, our technique will improve because of that. Thank you very much.